The Chinese leadership apparently doesn't know how good Korean food is, and K-pop hasn't been invented yet. So as far as they're concerned, that leaves just one answer. Korea is a dagger pointed at the heart of North China. Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. I'm Jason Clower. This is a course about why the PLA deliberately chose and kept obsolescent weapons, like the SKS carbine, and why they undervalued other weapons, like the Type 56 AK. Today we're going to talk about the Battle of Bohai Bay. This was the battle that the PLA leadership most feared in the early to mid 50s when the Type 56 family was adopted. This battle never actually happened, but for reasons that may seem strange to us at first, but actually have a pretty cogent internal logic, the PLA leaders thought that this was the battle that the Americans were going to wage against them. Now, as the Korean War is winding down, the Chinese leaders must accept that the Americans are in South Korea to stay. And as far as they're concerned, the Americans aren't there just because it's a cool vacation spot. They can't think of why else somebody would want to fight that hard for part of the Korean peninsula. The Chinese leadership apparently doesn't know how good Korean food is, and K-pop hasn't been invented yet. So that leaves just one answer. Korea is a dagger pointed at the heart of North China. We're going to focus today on the person of Peng Dehuai. We've met him once before when he was put in charge of China's war effort in Korea, somewhat reluctantly, and we watched him go from cautious optimism about the prospect of fighting Americans to learning bitter lessons in what it was like to move up a level of competition from the KMT and the Imperial Japanese Army, who weren't slouches, but were regional powers, to the top of the food chain and fighting against the Americans in a whole style of modern warfare that not only had they never tasted before, but they didn't really quite understand that it existed until they bumped into the Americans with their overwhelming firepower, with their seemingly limitless logistical capabilities and their torrents of supplies. There they learned what it was like to be a force that had 125 times fewer trucks per soldier than your enemy. They learned not just how endangered your supply lines could be from enemy air attack, but also how much that danger would multiply as your supply lines grew just a seemingly short distance. They learned just how much ammunition modern warfare expended. It was far beyond their projections. And they got a really bitter lesson in how feeble their own ammo manufacturing capacities were. I try not to give you too many statistics in this class, but here's one that's telling. In 1952, the Chinese economy had worked very, very hard to restore its ammunition manufacturing capacity in Shanghai, one of its old great industrial centers. And through really terrific effort, they managed in Shanghai to produce 49 million rounds of 7.62 by 54R rifle ammo for those Type 50 carbines that they were using, the cavalry carbines, and their accompanying machine guns. 49 million rounds they produced in a single year. That sounded really impressive, but when you do the numbers, it turns out that was only 10 rounds per man in the whole PLA, and those were shot up in no time. In the meantime, they had stuff on back order from the Soviet Union, but that stuff doesn't just transport itself over the Siberian vastness. No, Peng now knew in a whole new way what kind of capabilities a modern PLA would need, the sorts of vast logistical and supply wherewithal that it would take. And by the second half of the Korean War, Peng had been moved up from commanding the Chinese forces in Korea to commanding the whole PLA in China. He was put in charge of a thing that we'll learn more about later called the Central Military Commission, the Zhongyang Junwei. Chairman Mao was still its nominal head, but he barely even attended the meetings. Peng Dehuai was really in charge of the PLA and its planning and its strategic thinking, not just in a day-to-day way, but in a week-to-week, month-to-month way. He would report to Mao what he was doing there, but he really had a free hand, and that was a good thing because he was a very respected leader, and he combined long, long experience and talent with an appreciation for modernization. And Peng did a lot within the PLA leadership to sort of whip more old-fashioned, backward-looking leaders into shape and say, look, I know that we were a guerrilla army before. I know that we scoffed at things like positional warfare and defending real estate at the cost of men. But you have to understand, first, we're a sovereign country now. If the enemy hits our shores, as we think they will, we can't just go guerrilla and backpedal to the mountains and leave our citizens to fend for themselves in the face of the enemy. After all, we're the army whose trademark was we are the fish that swims in the sea of the people. The people support us and nurture us, and we take good care of them. So, if nothing else, it would just be politically completely unviable for if the PLA did that, they would be finished politically. Their whole title to legitimacy would be gone like a puff of smoke. So Peng, although old and eminent himself, is doing yeoman service by whipping the other PLA leaders into shape and saying, look, you got to be forward looking. We don't know how we're going to modernize. We don't know what kind of force we're going to create exactly. We have even less idea how we're going to pay for that or who we're going to recruit to be in it. But this is happening. Part of the reason that it has to happen now is they have reason to believe that the Americans are coming for them sooner or later. They're not crazy to think that. Sure, from where I sit now, it feels intuitively ludicrous to think that like Eisenhower would have ordered a massive invasion of China, but there were plenty of noises coming out of places like Washington that a very reasonable person could interpret as meaning that the Americans were coming for Korea round two, and this time maybe with nukes. So as the top man in Chinese national defense, Peng has a series of chicken and egg problems that are going to focus his attention on this place called the Bohai Bay that is of prime strategic importance to China, and it looks like they're most vulnerable of their many vulnerable possible points of attack. See, Peng's first chicken and egg problem is that China is vulnerable in a lot of places, but it doesn't have nearly the kind of resources that it would need to build for every contingency. They know that they're going to build a modern force now. They know that they're going to swap out a lot of those old-fashioned infantrymen for some sort of combined arms structure, but in order to make a more detailed picture than that, just sort of like hand-waving invocations of combined arms, they need to have an idea of how they're going to fight and what they can afford to fight with. They can't build every kind of modern combined arms branch at once. They have to be very focused. They have to crawl, then walk, then run. We've talked about that in a separate episode. And we've talked about the advice that the Soviet advisors gave them. But they're fast approaching the point where they have to start putting specific numbers into budget columns and deciding how big are they going to grow their armor? How big will they grow the artillery? How much are they going to put into engineering? Probably, what about transport and signals? How important is aviation going to be for them? And so on and so on and so on. Peng's problem is that, sure, he gets the logic of the Soviet advisors who are saying, first, build a war plan, and then we can work backward from that to figure out what kinds of forces you're going to need to enact that plan. Then we can start putting the appropriate number of people into these different training pipelines, and we can start buying and building the equipment that you'll need to make these parts. But Peng is also resisting that push, saying to his Soviet advisors, look, you're talking to us about playing with all these different kinds of toys that we, the Chinese leadership, we've never even handled them before. You're talking to us about making a symphony or an orchestra out of all these kinds of instruments that we've maybe only seen in pictures before. We need to kind of get in the sandbox. We need to sort of get our hands dirty a little bit to better understand on some sort of like vestibular level what we're dealing with. We need to pilot some armored and artillery and engineering units. We need to make some air defense battalions and see what goes well, see what goes wrong, make some course corrections. And Peng feels only then are we going to have enough information to make a plan that's not going to have to be torn down right away after it makes contact with reality. I think what's going on here is that Peng is giving voice to what I at least perceive as a very typical PLA and CCP way of operating, which is pragmatism, empirical pragmatism. China's a big place. Chinese leaders have traditionally been trained as generalists and then been put into the field to kind of feel their way through the unique problems that they encounter there. So, from where I sit, this is just one man's opinion, but I would say that in Chinese, especially modern Chinese managerial and leadership styles, there's a deep, deep appreciation for a kind of slow path-seeking pragmatism, what Deng Xiaoping called 摸着石头走, like feeling your way across the stream from rock to rock, not going on some preset plan that you're going to follow hell or high water, but leaving optionality so that step by step you can get some experience, course correct, make the next step, and hopefully improve your decision making progressively, kind of from the bottom up, as it were, so that you've got lots of experience and intuition and appreciation for your own foibles and strengths before you commit yourself irrevocably to some big prescriptive plan. So Peng is in a little bit of a bind. And I think he knows, too, that he's being a little bit of a hypocrite because when he's not talking to his Soviet advisors, trying to get them to get off his back, when he's talking to his fellow Chinese generals, what he's often preaching to them is standardization, 正规化, where the message for them that's coming from Peng is, I know you guys are used to dealing with things intuitively, ad hoc, kind of flying by the seat of your pants. I know that you like a managerial and leadership style that depends more on your relationships with these particular personalities that you've worked with for a long time, and you guys understand each other, and you can kind of freestyle things in this inspired way as you go. But Peng is saying, look, like it or not, we have to become a an institution now, not like a huge family business, but more like a corporation, something that's governed by procedures that are written down somewhere, where the leaders are sort of like cogs in a machine, and they can be taken from one place in the machine and plugged into another spot, and expect that they're going to be able to adjust pretty quickly to that because there's a standard culture and standard set of procedures and norms throughout the whole service. Maybe to put it differently, right now, the PLA is sort of like a great big, glorious, hand fitted Swiss clock, and they need to slowly turn it into something more like a modern piece of huge machinery with interchangeable parts. Because at the end of the day, as they're training up young leaders for all these different branches of service that they themselves barely understand, as they're training up like platoon leaders for tanks and battery commanders for artillery, and training up the signals troops and the anti-aircraft people, they're training those people up now in curriculum that they've just hastily borrowed from the Soviets and translated into Chinese. I can imagine exactly what it's like to be a teacher, an instructor in one of those courses. It's probably one of those classic situations where the instructor is just like 1 week ahead of his own students in the curriculum. That's already asking for a lot of jank when you finally put these hastily created pieces together. But when these young leaders arrive in their first commands, which are almost all of them going to be as components of a big infantry division, they need to know this is how your infantry division will operate. These are the capabilities of the infantry. This is what the infantry needs from you. Here is how you will fit into their bigger picture. Here is how you will liaise and interact with these other specialist subunits that are serving the mission of the big infantry division. You can't prepare these guys for their jobs if you don't know what their jobs are going to look like in advance. And the only way to do that is to have norms and standards to regularize your service. And so, even though that's very much in tension with the PLA's traditional improvisational way of doing things, it has to end. In this sense, the PLA is sort of like one of those successful family businesses that eventually decides that in order to keep developing, they have to corporatize themselves. And it's painful. It's full of many stupid feeling, Kafka-esque moments when you have to hire yourself an HR department. You know, anybody out there who's worked any job before, you can fill in the blanks from your own experience. And Peng is in the position of many good leaders where he he has to be a little bit of a hypocrite and preach different things to different audiences because there are real tensions in his organization that he needs to harmonize. So luckily, Peng is gifted with a very, very capable subordinate in the person of General Su Yu. We've met General Su before. That was in our episode about the badly failed Jinmen invasion debacle. And we met General Su there as the boss of the commander of that badly flawed operation. And we saw General Su attempt to take personal responsibility for that failure. Even though the mistakes that were made in disobedience to his orders. Su sure seems like a man who is very dedicated to his job. And we're going to see a lot more of him in this story as one of the chief proponents of a professionalized, modernized PLA, no matter who opposes him on that. Well, General Su helps Peng Dehuai kind of cut the Gordian knot by setting a set of priorities. It starts with a big threat assessment. China has three places that it needs to protect. It wants to protect the island of Hainan, which is very useful for naval and air purposes, where the PLA, Navy, and Air Force are working to take control of the sea and airspace back from the KMT Navy and Air Force. They also want to protect the coastal cities of Shanghai and Ningbo and those neighboring areas. Those are very important for commerce and shipping and manufacture. But above all, they most need to protect against an invasion coming through the Bohai Bay in the north of China. And their attention is centered on two strategic peninsulas, the Liaodong Peninsula and the Jiaodong Peninsula. The Liaodong Peninsula in particular isn't just a potential place that a threat could come from. It's been the site of many significant campaigns just in the last half century. Friends, originally I recorded a few minutes of historical background about the military history of the Liaodong Peninsula in the 20th century. But I think in order to keep from cluttering our narrative today, I'm going to spin that off later into a short little tangential kind of bonus mini episode. They've also got a lot of attention on the Jiaodong Peninsula of Shandong province. That hasn't been the scene of quite so much hot fighting, but that was also part of the colonial game, and it also offers a strategic benefit to anybody trying to invade the north of China. If you have either or both of those peninsulas, you'll have a very easy time then invading Tianjin and making your way up by just a road of less than 100 miles to Beijing. And that's not just a potential thing that could happen. That has happened in recent memory in northern China. Friends, same thing here. There are lots of stories about invasions of Beijing through Tianjin, including some by U.S. Marines. And I'm going to hold those for that same spin-off bonus mini episode. So Peng and Su and the other PLA leaders agree that they want to protect Hainan, they want to protect the area around Shanghai, but they must protect northern China, and they must fortify the Bohai Bay. That means the Air Force is now going to become extremely important. They figure that there's a very good chance that the US will begin with strategic nuclear bombing. And even though their Air Force can't stop that from happening, every bomber that they can prevent from getting in could save tens of thousands of lives and ease their war effort for the next step. That next step is going to consist of the PLA Navy kind of throwing itself across the path of the expected incoming American-led invasion fleet. Again, the Navy can provide only a thin screen of protection, but they'll do what they can to slow down and thin out those invading forces. One thing that's happening, I believe under General Su's direction, is that they're garrisoning and fortifying the islands in the bay as well as coastal installations. And their mission is to hold those positions to the end. They have civilians enrolled in the local militia who will assist them in that. And although I haven't seen this written down somewhere, I have to think that their expectation is that those positions are going to be completely steamrolled and annihilated. I think that also has to be true for the coastal fortifications that they're building. They learned a lot in Korea about hollowing out mountains and filling them with artillery positions that can be very effective but very hard to see, much less reach with counter battery fire or air power. The PLA may have a traditional cultural disdain for positional fighting, but by golly, Su Yu is going to try to make sure that they implement as much of that skill as they built. And again, I have to think that the people manning those positions are probably write-offs also. Why? Because their mission is to hold at any cost and buy time. They must hold for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months. They know that they're not going to be able to prevent US forces from getting some kind of lodgment, some sort of foothold on Chinese soil. And surely they know that the US Marines have never been thrown off a beach. But at all costs, they have to prevent the invaders from gaining a beachhead where they can start landing supplies and organizing themselves for a breakout. That's going to be incredibly difficult for them to do, but they must buy time. Of course, they don't have anything like the funding they would need to fortify the whole coastline around that vulnerable bay. So Su says we want to put about a quarter of our forces allocated for defending northern China, which is the vast bulk of the PLA under his plan. We want to put about a quarter of them on the coastline and make them very, very hard nuts to crack. But he says we want to hold back about three-quarters of our forces far enough into the rear that we can wait and watch and see which of the many possible invasion beaches the Marines are going to hit. And then we start rolling our mobile reserve toward that. And that's where we're going to put our best stuff and our best people, our most mobile, most mechanized forces, we're going to put in that mobile reserve. And they're going to be kind of like the linebacker in American football who's going to try to plug the gap that opens up in the front line before the enemy can shoot through it and get into the North China Plains and spread out. The mobile force is going to plug those gaps. And that too is going to be a very bloody, costly business. The Chinese will be in conversations with their Soviet advisors who will surely be telling them things like these armored divisions, once they're committed to combat, they attrit extremely quickly. They've got a half-life, a very short half-life. So you need to think of them not as like permanent chess pieces, but more like these time-limited assets where you pull the pin on them and then their strength and like their life bar, so to speak, just starts going. So maybe once you activate one of these armored formations, you've got 5 days for it to be all that it can be, and then it's going to be gone. So, truthfully, it looks like a very tall order for them to hold US forces and pen them in on their beachhead for 3 or 6 months. But that's what they need to do, according to this plan, because it's going to take that long for the PLA to mobilize its reserves, which right now are not terribly organized, but this is what they're looking toward. Activate and equip the reserve divisions. They're going to try to swell the army from its standing force of 100 divisions of regulars and triple that to 300 total. It's going to move them as expeditiously as it can toward the front, but if they're being realistic, they have to understand that these guys are probably going to be walking mostly. Uh, One thing that China is very poor in at this point is railroads and rail stock. Doesn't have many of those to begin with. They're going to be getting bombed to smithereens. So I think part of the reason that they're expecting such a long mobilization process of 3 to 6 months is that they're being realists and they're figuring, the reserves that we can send up to the front are going to be marching there. And while we're being realistic, let's face facts. A lot of them aren't going to make it. And the supplies are largely going to be walked up there also, because a lot of the trucks that are going to be available are going to be needing to be used closer to the front. And China doesn't have a whole lot of automobiles to go around right now. So probably we're going to see a lot of human and mule portage like we'd see in the rear of the Dien Bien Phu campaign. And something that we know from the Chinese Civil War and then later from Vietnam is that this system of human portage of supplies is very supply intensive. That is, the porter, him or herself, needs to be fed and needs to end up eating much of what he or she can carry on the long trip to the front. So I think the leaders are calculating all of this in as best they can, and that accounts for this really, to me, quite surprising, very ambitious mission that they've assigned to the frontline troops of holding for 3 to 6 months. Of course, at some time it may be that the enemy is going to break out of its beachhead, but the longer we can give the rear and the reserves to mobilize, the better their chance will be. In the meantime, we may get lucky. Maybe there'll be a political solution. Maybe the Americans will get tired and go away. That's above our pay grade. But the prime directive for the PLA now will be protect northern China. Stop the invaders on the beaches and hold them there for 3 to 6 months. Give the rest of the massive country time to mobilize, train, march to the sound of the guns. Friends, this has been Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. Please consider sharing. We have much more to come.